Hello, good evening, and welcome back once again to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we are learning how to guard our minds against all of the ways that we are under attack from the mainstream media, the entities that control the news, the publications, the movies, really our culture, and how we can think better, reason clearer, and just protect ourselves, protect our loved ones against all of the manipulations that are out there in the world these days. If you're just joining the channel, we have been discussing a man named Edward Bernays, specifically his exploits in the early part of the 20th century. He was an enigmatic figure who was instrumental in bringing the ideas of deep-level psychoanalytics or psychoanalysis into the mainstream culture of America by developing concepts that his uncle Sigmund Freud had pioneered in Europe. Specifically, Bernays was keyed into the idea that human beings are essentially irrational and are always being driven by subconscious or unconscious desires and fears, and as such, if those drivers are properly understood, they're able to be manipulated and controlled to serve any end that may be of present need to someone who might be wanting to exert control or manipulation over people. Tonight, we are going to pick up with this and discuss some more of what sorts of things Bernays was instrumentally involved in with respect to government and the attempts to spread democracy across the globe during the 20th century. When we last met, we discussed what was happening in America in the 1920s and how big business and financial interests took special interest in Bernays' work with respect to manipulating people's spending and purchasing habits. The 1920s were a boom time for the American economy, and much of that growth could be greatly credited to Bernays and his public relations methods. While the Cultural Renaissance and the paradigm shift was happening in America, over in Europe, things were changing as well. Germany's defeat in World War I left a vacuum in the power dynamic and a mood of social unrest throughout the country. It was the kind of unrest that can really only come from serious crisis and hardship. It was at this time where Freud's concepts regarding the irrationality of humans became cemented in the minds of the world. The Nazis had taken control of the country and were imposing all kinds of barbaric and evil practices in order to grow and maintain their power and vision of a utopian future dominated by their master race of Germanic Aryans. At the center of the horrors of the Nazi regime was a man named Joseph Goebbels. He was the party minister of propaganda. If Bernays is to be thought of as the father of propaganda, it was Goebbels who would push the concept into a territory that would forever alter the meaning of the term and its use throughout the course of human history. Goebbels was a master at manipulation and the targeting of deeply repressed emotional drivers hiding in all people, and his exploitation of the mass psychology of the German people was partly what led to the systematic extermination of millions of people during the Nazi reign. Likewise, in Russia, the communists under Lenin and Stalin had upended the monarchy of that nation and seized power. That regime would eventually be responsible for mass murder at levels which made the Nazis seem tame by comparison. Eventually the same would happen in China, and really the horrors enacted upon certain scapegoated groups of people during the 20th century are well known, and we would all do well to remember what can happen when these mass-level manipulations are enacted at scale. Freud's pessimism and disgust with the human race could be seen as justified in light of the atrocities that were carried out over the decades of war, and it's no wonder why he held the views that he did given all that he had seen. We will not be digging into just what happened and went on in Europe, as there's plenty of information on that available all over the internet. However, What we are interested in here is what all of this chaos and destruction of human life meant for us in America, and what would eventually spread across the globe. As the atrocities of the Nazis were revealed to the world, the death and destruction was more than many were able to comprehend, much less come to terms with. In many ways, it confirmed to the world that Freud's ideas surrounding the dangerous and animalistic barbarism that lurked beneath the surface of society was a very real thing. Recognizing this, the American government and those that were interested in spreading democracy around the world decided that they needed to take action in order to keep those forces at bay. It was the deeply repressed aggression and emotional volatility of the masses that was believed to be what caused the upheaval in Germany and Russia. And the leaders of America went to work to make sure the same things would not happen in this country. The powers that be decided that the only way to ensure democracy would grow and continue to spread was to make sure that these dark forces remained under the surface where they could be controlled. They had to make sure that the population was docile and accepting of the authority and power structures that were operating, and to not rise up and overthrow the powerful. What they sought was a way to control these deeper desires in humans and ensure that the population of the country remained happy and therefore amenable to the proliferation of democracy and the aims of democratic government. In order to do this, the U.S. would begin a number of projects that would take what was being studied in human psychology and apply new methods of mass control. In stepped Edward Bernays and the various public relations men to fill the needs of big government once again. To highlight the efficacy of what Bernays was able to do, we should take a look at a situation that played out in Guatemala. At the time, one of Bernays' biggest public relations clients was the United Fruit Company, which is now known as Chiquita. I'm sure we've seen all those bananas just littered across all the supermarkets all over the country. This group was heavily active in the growing of bananas in Guatemala, and the economic influence they held over the country gave them a great deal of control over who was placed in the top offices of the government. The country was essentially run by small-time dictators who served the business interests of United Fruit, and was known to be a banana republic. That's kind of where we get the term. Then, in 1950, a young officer named Colonel Arbenz was elected president, and one of his major goals was that he was going to take back the control of the country from United Fruit and ultimately give it back to the people. Arbenz enacted a decree that the government would seize the ownership of the land that was being controlled by United Fruit in an effort to shift the economic prosperity into the hands of the citizens as opposed to a foreign business interest. United Fruit decided Bernays would be useful in dealing with their potential loss of control, as well as the economic share that was potentially going to be really affected. The strategy would be to shift the perception of what had happened in the eyes of the American people with respect to Arbenz's election. To do this, a propaganda campaign was enacted that was focused on convincing the American public that Arbenz's election was a signal that communism had infiltrated Latin America and was threatening the United States, just outside our border. The tactic would be to play off of the hysteria of the Red Scare and the inherently felt need to defend American democratic ideals abroad so that we remained free in a prosperous country. While Arbenz was a democratic socialist, he was not affiliated with Moscow and the communist regime controlling Russia at the time. So, in order to change the perception, Bernays organized a trip to Guatemala where he brought a number of American journalists who had very little knowledge of the country and its politics, and he arranged for them to meet with very selected politicians who told them that Arbenz was a communist infiltrator controlled by Moscow. During the trip, violent anti-American protests broke out in the capital, which many suspected were organized by Bernays himself. He also created a fake news outlet called the Middle American Information Bureau, which ran fabricated stories depicting Guatemala as a new front from which the communists were preparing to attack America. These stories were funneled through the already existing American media outlets, of which Bernays also held deep ties, and the propaganda methods worked to great effect. The emotions of the nation were stirred to just the right level, where there would be little resistance to enacting what was later revealed to be a part of a plot from then-President Eisenhower aimed at toppling the Arbenz government. Under the direction of the Dulles brothers, both Alan and John Foster Dulles, the CIA carried out Operation PB Success, which was a secret coup to overthrow Arbenz and his control, thus allowing United Fruit to regain the power and influence it once held over Guatemala. Coincidentally enough, the Dulles brothers held a large financial stake in United Fruit, and they used their power, along with Bernays' tactics of propaganda and mass psychological manipulation, to carry out the coup. Through funding, outfitting, and training from the CIA, a rebel army was formed and a new leader installed that would be sympathetic to the interests of the United States. Once all of these components were in place, the CIA carried out bombings and attacks that would be spun by the media and Bernays as necessary for the liberation of Guatemala from communist control. Arbenz eventually fled the country, and the puppet leader was installed, thus ensuring the corporate and governing power would remain in the hands of United Fruit, and the United States could carry on its financial interests in that part of Latin America. What we see here is the merging of corporate interests and government control, the public-private partnership. What is important to bear in mind when thinking and learning about this history is how there arose a small group of men who had decided amongst themselves that they would be the ones who should make the decisions for the people of America and how we are to think and reason about the world. These quote-unquote elite and specialized class of men elevated themselves above the rest of us and have been working to maintain their power and control over our lives for decades. This story about Guatemala is just one of many that have happened over the years, and the tools and tactics used by Bernays and the U.S. government are still being foisted upon us today, only now it's ballooned into a completely uncontrollable and really nefarious monster. If you'd like, please add any comments in the comment section below about different examples that you can think of that point to this same kind of manipulation that's happening today. In the coming videos, we'll take a look at some of the mind control methods that are being used now in the 21st century, and we'll return to examine some other figures from history in order to paint a more vivid picture of what has been done to us so that we may learn to spot areas where those self-appointed elites continue to exert their power to keep us enslaved to their agendas and means of enacting further control. So until then, check in on your loved ones, stay safe, stay diligent, and stay vigilant, always keeping your minds on guard.